Welcome to this session focused on peer network strategies, a powerful research-based approach for connecting students with and without disabilities throughout the school day, and then helping them to forge new friendships with peers they might not otherwise have come to know. Now, to set the stage for our discussion, I'd like you to do a little mental exercise with me. I'm going to ask you to go back in time to your own schooling and think about the school level maybe at which you currently work, elementary or middle or even high school. How would you answer this question? What did you look forward to most about going to school? Now, I bet I can guess some of your answers. Time spent with friends, hanging out between classes, eating lunch together, maybe playing at recess, being part of a sports team or extracurricular club, maybe a favorite class or teacher, pizza Friday, field trips, much, much more. I could go on and on and on. Here's the thing. When I ask kids this, rarely are their classes the first thing to come to their mind. Yes, there are exceptions, and I'm sure your classes are always named among their favorites, but it's often the exception rather than the rule. And I'm not suggesting that our classes are unimportant, by no means, but they aren't the only things that mark our memories. In fact, most answers focused on the in-between times. Here's what I mean. It's the times before and after and in between classes that we and kids often mention when we think about what makes school fun and enjoyable. The times in blue on your screen. These are the times when kids hang out together, on the bus, at their lockers, in homeroom, maybe at breaks in the courtyard or over lunch in the cafeteria, maybe on the playground or in an array of extracurricular activities. My point is not that this is all that we should attend to, but by no means. It's simply that we should be very intentional about not overlooking these times. It's in the in-between times when friendships are often developed and deepened, and yet these are often the times when students with disabilities are apart from others during the school day. You see, peer network strategies provide a wonderful way to ensure that we maximize the social and relationship building opportunities that exist all throughout all aspects of school life. And I'm excited to share more about it. At the end of this session, you'll be able to describe peer network strategies in a clear and appealing way, to detail the key components of this research-based support model, to explain the potential benefits of this approach for students and for their peers, and to learn about additional resources that can help you if you decide to implement these strategies at your school. Now, as with peer support arrangements, which is another session, this intervention approach can be embedded well within the peer-to-peer model at your school and when helping your students access the array of available social opportunities. So what are peer network strategies? Well, they involve creating a core social group of peers around a student with a disability that connects regularly outside of the classroom. Now, let me offer kind of a basic overview. Peer networks typically involve 3 to 6 peers without disabilities who are selected on the basis of shared interests or other commonalities. Now, the group meetings, which typically take place weekly or biweekly, can happen in the cafeteria during lunch or on the playground at recess, in an empty classroom during an advisory period, or even as part of an extracurricular or after-school event. Now, during each of those meetings, students participate in mutually enjoyable activities like eating a meal, maybe playing a game, completing a service project, listening to music, endless opportunities. And of course, there's an adult there who's initially part of these meetings, who's checking in, providing support, monitoring progress. Now, these peer partners also arrange times to catch up with the focus student outside of formal meetings. This might include walking to class together or hanging out during breaks, maybe attending a club meeting, getting together outside of school, again, any number of things. And gradually, that adult facilitator turns over responsibility for the network meetings over to the students. So some of the goals of this approach are to increase opportunities for students with disabilities to just meet others at their school, to strengthen students' social and communication skills, to help students develop new friendships, to connect with peers with whom they can have fun, to encourage students to become more involved together in school and other community activities, or to shift attitudes throughout your school. Now, these aren't the only things. These are not only about fostering just any kind of relationship, not helping relationships, but rather more friendships. These are relationships that really support full participation and often, as we said, can develop into students really picking one another as friends. So let me illustrate this, though, in another way, but now focusing on kind of key players. You see, each peer network is built around an individual student with autism or other developmental disabilities, and it's a student, could be a student of any age. And those networks have mostly been used for students from upper elementary through high school. But these can also be valuable for students across the sort of entire spectrum with a full range of support needs, including those who do and don't have significant intellectual disability and those who do and don't have complex communication needs or challenging behaviors. Now, the peers without disabilities who join the peer network are sometimes referred to as peer partners. You might use a different name at your school. A good goal is to select 3 to 6 peers from the same school who'd be invited to participate. And the peers you select will make a huge difference. And I'm going to come back to the process of selection shortly. But for now, it's just important to note that they volunteer to participate and would ideally be kids who have interests and experiences in common with the focus student. Now, each peer network also has school staff who take responsibility for organizing and maintaining the group. This is called the network facilitator. And almost any adult in the school could serve in this way. Although special educators and paraprofessionals may be the first people who come to mind, don't overlook general educators and coaches or club leaders or school counselors or even related service providers. The benefit of involving these staff is that they often have relationships with large numbers of students without disabilities and may have an easier time identifying peers who have shared interests with the focus student. Now, even if the general educator or special educator rather isn't the facilitator, they still have an important role. They'll be part of any initial planning for the network. They might train that facilitator on how to implement this intervention. They may be part of the initial orientation meeting, and they may maintain regular communication with the facilitator and potentially even with families. Now, I'm going to wrap up this slide really just by mentioning 2 other valued partners. Don't overlook families, right? Collaborating with them is essential if your goal is to foster social connections that extend beyond the school day and last over time. And parents can provide the network facilitator with information about their child's strengths and interests and out-of-school activities, all things that could provide the basis for connections and conversations with peers. And likewise, schools can keep parents informed about upcoming activities taking place outside of school so transportation can be arranged. And then finally, related service providers can have a consultative or support role. For example, a behavior specialist might help identify ways of diminishing challenging or stereotypical behaviors that hinder participation in inclusive activities or interactions with peers. An occupational therapist might suggest technological or other adaptations that enable students to participate more fully in shared activities with peers. Or a speech-language pathologist might emphasize instruction on social and communication skills that could be useful during peer network meetings, as well as enable students to use their AAC devices more fluently across settings. So don't let the picture on the screen then overwhelm you here. How does all this work come together, I guess, to successfully launch a peer network? Well, I'll cover the 6 basic steps that are shown on your screen. Planning the network, equipping a facilitator, inviting and identifying peers, orienting students and peers, holding regular network meetings, and evaluating outcomes. And at the end, I'm going to point you to some additional readings and resources where you can certainly learn more. Now, the starting point for many of the approaches in this series should be to make sure that your school principal and leadership is supportive. Securing their buy-in can be helpful when later trying to recruit staff and students throughout the school. And principals who affirm the importance of fostering positive relationships among students, they can communicate that commitment throughout the broader school. At the same time, you're going to need to decide a few things related to the peer network, like which students would benefit from having a peer network. Who in the school would be the best to facilitate it? How will peers be selected and invited? And when and where will the network meet? And of course, the answers here will vary from school to school and often from student to student. This is where individualization becomes all important. And so hang in there. I'll give more guidance along the way. But let me just say a few words now about the focus student, the student around whom this network is established. Peer networks are designed to develop social connections and encourage the formation of friendships. And so they can be ideal for students who maybe have few peer relationships or rarely participate in everyday school or after-school activities or do that alone, or who would just benefit from strengthening their social and communication skills. Now, definitely ask students if they want to be part of a peer network. And then consider some of the following questions as a way of determining which social-related goals might be addressed using this approach. For example, does the student initiate interactions with others? And are those interactions reciprocal? Do their conversational topics, are they appropriate to the person and context? Does the student use their communication device? Do they have a great group of friends? Does the student interact more with adults than with peers? is a student involved in those in-between activities with their peers? And the answers to these questions might help you decide which peers to involve and what types of activities to really build into the network or build that network around. Now, the next step is to equip a peer network facilitator. And this is especially important if you're not the one serving in this role. Now, I've already noted that almost anyone can serve in this role. And in fact, this is a great way to try to engage more of your school colleagues in getting to know your students and playing a role in fostering inclusion and belonging. So reach out to those paraprofessionals and social workers and extracurricular leaders and even general educators. Now, several other factors are worth considering when identifying potential network facilitators. First, you really want them to be committed to the goal of fostering friendships among students with and without disabilities. And so they should understand the importance of emphasizing reciprocal relationships rather than strictly helping relationships. And second, they should have a knack for seeing and making connections among students. After all, they're essentially building bridges among participating students, and they do this by regularly highlighting the interests and activities and experiences that students share in common. And third, it's good for facilitators to have some familiarity with the students with disabilities around whom the peer network is being established. So knowing the interests and strengths of a particular student, the ways in which they communicate best with others, and the factors that could set the occasion for challenging behaviors, all enable the facilitator to effectively communicate relevant information to peers and to navigate potential roadblocks. If they don't know the student, create time and space for them to come to do so. And fourth, they should have the time available to meet with the peer network on a regular basis. Now, facilitating a peer network itself takes relatively little time, maybe 20 to 30 minutes per week. The work initially required to invite students and orient them to their roles, that does require some upfront investment of time, of course. Now, the primary responsibilities of a peer network facilitator are listed here. They're to identify peers to become members of the peer network, to invite those peers to participate, to have an initial orientation meeting with the students and their peers, to be present during those meetings and facilitate as needed to ensure everyone is included and participating in activities and conversations, to check in regularly with peer network members to answer their questions, to offer encouragement, just to evaluate the impact, and to communicate with a special educator or IEP team about the network regularly. Well, the success and longevity of a peer network will be influenced by the peers who are involved. And all this process, I think, for selecting peers is a bit more art than science. Some key lessons emerge when we're implementing these throughout your school. Now, it's important to begin by asking the student with autism or other developmental disabilities about the peers with whom they would like to get to know, about the peers they would like to participate. But some students who presently have few existing friendships or limited involvement in inclusive activities may sometimes struggle to offer suggestions. And in those cases, school staff can be really key in helping select peers who might accomplish the goals of the network. So what are some of the qualities or characteristics that you might consider when deciding which peers to involve? Well, consider some of the following questions to help you really zero in on the right students. Which peers share interests or hobbies or activities in common with the student? Maybe which peers already interact with the student and might become more engaged in this network? Who could model positive behaviors for the student and who has good interpersonal skills? Which peers are part of a larger social group? Which peers have more consistent attendance? Which peers would benefit themselves from involvement? And which peers have common time available during the school day? Now, let me emphasize here the importance of being very open about which peers to involve. We find that teachers tend to think only about high-achieving students or those with perfect attendance or behaviors. And actually, quite often, it's students who don't fit those descriptions can also be incredibly impactful in these particular roles. So keep an open mind with that. Now, let me punctuate the importance of finding students with shared interests. It could be any of these on the screen or certainly beyond. These are questions that you might pose. What does the student love to do for fun? What shows do they enjoy watching? What music do they listen to? What hobbies do they pursue? What teams do they root for? What places do they love to spend time? And then ask yourself, who else in this school loves some of those very same things? And if you can't think of anyone, ask yourself, who could help you find those peers? Well, as with other approaches, invitations for peers to become involved can be extended in a variety of ways. Each, of course, comes with both strengths and drawbacks. For example, you can ask students with disabilities who they want to spend time with, and you should do that. You can observe to see which peers the student seems drawn to. You can make general school announcements about the availability of opportunities to support inclusion and belonging at the school, and then guide people to speak to a particular teacher if they're interested. You can ask general education teachers for their recommendations, or identify existing friendship groups or cliques that could be invited together. You can also meet with school clubs focused around the student interests. And finally, you can draw students in students who are already involved in some of your school's peer-to-peer program to think about how they might be part of peer networks within that as well. Now, some schools host various events designed to draw in students who might make good peer network members. They might have a panel on inclusion at an assembly, or host a pizza party, or have a video screening focused on inclusion and disability. They might plan an inclusive field trip or service project, or host a booth or table at orientation meetings for students and parents, or even just create a short video to play during morning announcements. And of course, other students can be great sources of guidance on what would be attractive to students in terms of this kind of inviting and recruiting. Now, the first meeting of the peer network provides a time to orient students with and without disabilities to the goals and activities of the peer network. It's really a time to get students excited about the group and to make sure they know what to expect. So don't skip over this important step. Now, specifically, the goals of this orientation meeting are to clarify the purpose of the network, to facilitate introductions among participating students and the facilitator, to discuss activity ideas for their upcoming meetings, to share suggestions for other peers at the school whose involvement might be encouraged, or to determine other times of the school day when students can connect with each other. It's also to establish a regular meeting time for the rest of the semester or school year, and to answer any questions students might have about the network or the time that they spend together. Now, this meeting might last about 30 to 45 minutes, so allow a little extra time for that first meeting as well. So let me also share an example of what such an orientation might look like. When students don't already know one another, icebreakers or maybe other introductory activities can be incorporated to help students learn about each other's interests and strengths and communication preferences. And the facilitator can really cover any number of other additional topics relevant to the success of this peer network. That might include things like providing a general overview of the goals of the group or the social-related skills that students might benefit from growing further. It might include identifying each student's interests as a way of discovering commonalities, as well as learning the unique experiences and perspectives that each student brings to the group. It might involve describing and modeling basic communication skills as well, and social support strategies, or discussing the importance of confidentiality and respectful language. You might schedule regular meeting times and suggest how students would connect with one another outside of those meetings. And you'd want to provide guidance on when to seek assistance from the facilitator and to explain their role. And of course, address any other expectations that are specific to being part of that particular peer network. Now, this is also a good time to share ideas for how to interact with someone who uses different communication modalities, including augmentative and alternative communication devices. Dr. Elizabeth Biggs, who's an expert on peer networks for students with complex communication needs, suggests teaching peers to do things like use plenty of wait time to give a student an opportunity to respond, to initiate interactions, to learn to recognize and respond to all of the different ways the student might communicate through gestures and sounds and facial expressions and AAC, to demonstrate valued social skills such as maybe maintaining a conversation or taking turns, and demonstrating play skills such as ways to play with different types of toys or pretend play or play games with rules like card games or board games. And those are just examples, but you'll want to think about how to make sure that students are really primed and prepared in this way. Well, with the orientation behind you, the fifth step is to hold regular peer network meetings. And the primary goal of these weekly meetings is for students to develop and deepen their relationships with one another through enjoyable conversations and shared activities. They also brainstorm ways to enhance the quality of their social contacts during and outside of regular meeting times. Now, the meetings can be held almost anywhere. It could be at lunch, at recess, during a free period, at a skinny block, if your school has that, or right before or after school. And for some students with autism, however, meeting in maybe a loud or chaotic place like a crowded cafeteria could be difficult, so keep each student's needs in mind. Now, most peer network meetings involve the following segments in various configurations. There's sort of this arrival time and informal conversations when kids are just catching up and talking. There's some participation in a shared activity like playing a game or listening to music or completing a project. There's some conversation or discussion about their weekly social contacts when they're getting together regularly. And then there might be feedback from that adult facilitator. For example, a peer network meeting at lunch might involve an opening period where students are getting their meals and arriving to the meeting location, which might be a particular lunch table or an empty classroom or a courtyard. There may be a time when students play a game or converse about an upcoming school event or plan a future after-school activity, and then a wrap-up discussion when students plan to connect socially with each other between meetings. It is, of course, important to ensure that the activities that students are doing are enjoyable and age-appropriate for all. Now, one great way to accomplish this is to have all of the participating students identify things that they'd like to do together. And in addition, you might compile activities typical for their grade level, or find activities that are really interesting to all of the group members. Providing multiple opportunities for interaction. You want to have activities that are interactive and interdependent. They have interdependent elements. And you want activities that allow for a valued role for everyone in the activity, that also allow interaction modes that are appropriate to the student, for example, if they use a communication device, and activities that are practical to implement in the location and the available time. If you only have 20 minutes, there's certain games that won't really work for that time period. Now, as the weekly meetings take place, the role of the facilitator is to make sure that the meeting's going well and that everyone is meaningfully engaged. And so I'm going to put on your screen a series of reflection questions that you can use to gauge how well the peer network is going. It's kind of a sort of a fidelity checklist, if you will. And it's organized around these three questions. Are the student and their peers interacting during the meeting? And then some follow-up questions. Is the facilitator supporting the student and their peers? And some associated follow-up questions. And are the student and their peers getting together outside of the scheduled meetings? Now, of course, the other job of the facilitator is to facilitate, to guide, and to connect, to identify ways of prompting and reinforcing and guiding students and their peers in ways that lead to more meaningful interactions, more engagement, more enjoyable time together. Now, remember, it's just the right amount of support, not too much, not too little, and always fade that support over time. Well, that takes us to the final step, which is evaluating outcomes. It's just so important that you intentionally reflect on the process and outcomes associated with peer network interventions. You'll want to ensure that the students are enjoying their participation and that the network is accomplishing its intended purpose. Now, most peer networks are going to go well, but that's not always true. They may need refinements to make them work better, and sometimes additional training is needed or new peers have to be introduced. And you'll want to know this early on so that course corrections can be made. So many of the strategies I discussed in the other session on evaluating peer support arrangements are also applicable here as well. So collect data on the communication skills and social skills and the play skills used by the students with disabilities. Notice the extent to which students are interacting well and often, using their communication devices appropriately and often, demonstrating relevant social skills, forming new friendships, spending time together the rest of the week. These are just a sampling of the kinds of things you might observe as part of these support strategies. And of course, conversation with participants is another way to understand their experiences and outcomes and recommendations. And there are several people who you might ask to share their insights. For example, ask students with disabilities what they think about being part of a peer network. What do they enjoy most and least? What ideas or input do they have for making the network better, and about the things that they're learning about themselves and others through their involvement? And ask peers about their own experiences in the network, the successes and challenges that they've encountered, how they would characterize the new relationships they're forming, and the ideas they have for supporting greater inclusion at their school, and even about the supports that they feel would help them serve more effectively in this role. And of course, ask special educators and other school staff about the growth that they're noticing, about the peers with whom the student's spending time throughout the school day, and about the ideas they have for growing that network. And don't forget about parents. Ask what their child tells them is working about what it's like to work with their peers, what they've noticed that suggests their child is enjoying that experience, whether their child describes these peers as friends, and whether they're connecting with one another outside of school by phone, through texting, online, or even in person. Here's just a few sample quotes that illustrate the impact that peers, students with disabilities, and their parents saw as a result of their work. And it raises kind of the question, what might you hear as well as you implement these various approaches in your schools as well? Maybe these are the kinds of quotes that will be overheard in your hallways and classrooms and elsewhere in your school. And you can pause here to take a little bit more time to read these as well. Well, peer networks are a wonderful way to promote shared activities and friendship formation at your school. And so let me just conclude with a few final thoughts. First is start small and launch additional networks gradually. And share your successes at faculty meetings as a way of engaging other staff and additional teachers. Collect photos and videos so you can show others what these peer networks look like, of course with student permission. And engage peers in helping you invite the involvement of other students. And always use data to make adjustments all along the way. If you want to read more about peer networks, I've placed a few options up on the screen, and there's a good practice guide that's also posted on the START website along with this video. Of course, don't forget that the Michigan START website is full of wonderful resources related to supporting relationships and learning for students with disabilities, and check out those peer-to-peer playbooks for additional strategies. Well, I hope you enjoyed this session, that you've come to see new possibilities for students with and without disabilities at your school. Please be sure to check out the other sessions in this series, and thank you for the good work you're doing to foster inclusion and belonging at your schools as well.